Okay, this is Jill Gunter from Espresso Systems checking in from Modular Summit, day two. It's all wrapping up here. It's been a long but great couple of days. And I have the privilege of chatting with Jim from Catalyst. Jim, do you want to just introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I'm Jim. I'm one of two co-founders of Catalyst. I focus more on the product and ops side, and yeah, I've been a crypto builder for coming up on 6 years now.
Hell yeah.
Mhm.
Awesome. So we've heard a lot at Modular Summit in the last couple of days about how we have this roll-up centric future of Ethereum and blockchains in general. And one of the big topics that keeps coming up is the fragmentation that has come about as a result of this roll-up centric future and roadmap that we're all building. And that is obviously something that is top of mind for you. So I was hoping you could share a little bit about how you think about interoperability, why it's important, like why should we care, and just give me a rundown of what you think is most interesting right now in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I've been super impressed with the dialogue that we've been having at Modular Summit. I
Yeah,
think people are not shying away from, kind of the big questions that are being unearthed by having, kind of a more robust modular blockchain thesis. And one of those is fragmentation, right? Um, Actually, I think the best trade-off that someone said was basically like um, there is a trade-off spectrum between how composable you want your application to be, and it's kind of like use case specific, versus like how kind of end to end of an experience that you want to give for
yeah,
those users. And so right now, it makes a lot of sense for applications that are kind of on that latter bucket to make their own roll up. But if you're kind of on that former bucket and you really need that kind of diverse ecosystem to interact with, it makes less sense. And so maybe to tie back to the original question that you had, Catalyst is basically servicing that first bucket, right? If we want to ensure that the modular blockchain thesis is going to flourish and have, millions of applications building their own rollups that are configurable and, kind of all are able to communicate with one another very seamlessly, you need to have that kind of really robust and also easy to deploy interoperability um, kind of mechanism in order to have that composability and make it seem like it's just like one single state shard, right?
yeah.
And Catalyst is doing that on the interoperability side, but also on the liquidity side, which is just a fancy way of saying, we're trying to move the money between all the different rollups.
Which is everything for the DeFi world. I would argue. I
Yeah.
mean, I think yes, I can see this vision of the future where, for example, gaming companies and gaming applications maybe want to just have their own standalone environments and interoperability and composability is a little less important for them. But when I think about almost all of the big applications that I use or go in and play around with that exist on blockchains today, composability is such a huge part of that. I
Yeah.
mean, even the whole money Legos narrative, like that's the whole idea here. And I think that, as you say, I mean, it's been really wonderful actually to have the conversations over the last couple of days where people are acknowledging that this is an unanswered question and acknowledging that we need to start tackling it in order to kind of keep pushing the vision of Web3, blockchains, crypto, whatever we're calling it these days
Yeah.
forward. And I don't know if you were in one of the panels yesterday. It was the roll up as a service panels.
Yeah.
They were asked, what is sort of the biggest pain point that you're hearing from customers as they're thinking about deploying rollups? And I think it was Neil from Eclipse said, oh, hands down, it's interoperability. And so, yeah, I think it's really important that we have folks like you working on this. Um, so I'm curious how you're thinking about the problem space and like there's probably I mean certainly I know when we think about product internally at Espresso, there's things that we're pretty confident that we solve and then there's things that we're pretty confident we help with, but we don't have like a silver bullet for and interoperability is one of those. And I'm curious how you're thinking about that with your product of like what are you pretty confident you can solve? What are the trade-offs? what are the kind of hazy gray areas that you need to still work through or that you want to, plug into other systems, maybe hopefully like us to help support with.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So the way that we're trying to tackle this is, of course, like we're trying to tackle this modular future, and trying to connect them all together and trying to have some sort of like seamless, like shared liquidity layer in order to, prevent this fragmentation and also have a good user experience, that makes it seem like, again, that we're kind of all operating within the same, state machine. Um, and our thesis is basically, like sovereign liquidity. Um, and so said differently, like we are in the business of designing roll-up economies. And so all these
I love that.
roll-ups, thanks. Yeah, I actually thought about that earlier today. I was like,
Stick with that. It
yeah,
works.
it's the good thing about keep saying what you do to different people and getting like kind of iterate on it.
Yeah.
But all these roll-ups, they have very different preferences on how they want to have assets or interact with assets. I do think what we're seeing is, at least right now, a lot of roll-ups really want sovereign liquidity, and so they want to own their own assets. They want to be in charge of, the end-to-end experience of issuance and dissemination and accounting and, risk mitigation factors. And so being beholden to something like a wrap token, right, where they're kind of taking a token that lives natively on another chain and bring it in, is, not sufficient for them, especially, as this, their plans for the role kind of matures, right? It's pretty good kind of maybe to start. And so our solution is basically, how do you do away with token wrap bridges that we've kind
Yeah.
of known and probably not loved
I
for
was
the
gonna
past few
say.
years? And how do we just interact with native assets? And so these rollups, we're trying to tackle this like cold start problem. When you have a rollup, it's kind of like a barren wasteland. There might be a native token, there might be some preloaded state, but that's really it, right? You
Yeah.
can't really do much else beyond that if you want to connect to other places. And so we're designing economies in ways for these rollups to interact with anyone else that they want, right? Like trade partners, basically. And so if they want to interact with liquidity hubs like Ethereum, you can do so. And so you're pairing these native assets that live on the rollup, and you can kind of connect them to popular assets on Ethereum like USDC or ETH. Or if you want to connect to another rollup, and kind of have this intro rollup ecosystem economy, this is something that we're doing with Eclipse actually. Their games versus their depend networks versus their DeFi networks all have their own niches, but they can actually have synergistic effects when they build economies with each other. And so we're effectively allowing for the, again, sovereign liquidity to be able to interact with one another and design these economies for them.
I love it. Do you find, as you are building and presumably, I mean, even just over the last 2 days, talking to a lot of roll up builders and roll up teams, do you find that any of them have any pushback on interoperability? I've heard a few teams sort of have the reaction of like, well, in the grand vision of the future that we have, we do want to own all of that stuff. We do want to have just sovereign liquidity. We want to have some moat or lock in on the TVL within our roll up. We want to own the experience of issuance and all of these things on it. It's a rare perspective to hear, but I've felt also at times like it's an honest perspective, as of course these roll-up teams are also thinking about their own business models. Have you encountered any of that? How would you respond?
I've definitely encountered it. I'm glad you're raising it because it's not, it like any kind of creation of an economy, like these teams need to think about how borderless you really want to be it,
Yeah.
right? Or that you really want to construct it.
Yeah, it is like a free trade kind of
Yeah.
policy, right?
Yeah. And so, I would say you can almost bucket it in like a maturation kind of cycle where the very early roll-ups or early applications, they don't mind, right? They're like, this is great, like we just need injection. Maybe as you get a bit kind of more mature, maybe even looking at existing Cosmos app chains, they're probably saying, I'm okay with this moat, right? I want people to come in. They're always interested
Yeah.
in having more liquidity come in. they're less interested in having liquidity come out, but it is kind of like a uh, two-way kind of construction. I mean, of
Totally.
course,
Yeah, you have to kind of accept that as an
yeah,
ecosystem,
yeah.
right?
So I'm glad you're bringing it up. To be fair, like there are ways where you can add more friction
Yeah.
for the moving out of assets, and that's something that you can do on Catalyst quite trivially.
I
But
suppose you can always throttle that part of it, right? You can
yeah,
always create a bit more friction and kind of
yeah,
customize the experience for roll-ups and therefore their users in that way.
yeah. It's like taxes,
Yeah.
basically, right?
Yeah. Exactly. It's
Yeah,
interesting. This does sort of suddenly get into like a parallel of nation states and like macroeconomic policy, which is kind of cool. I hadn't previously thought of that. Um, so we're really excited about Catalyst at Espresso because we think a lot about interoperability. Again, we think shared sequencing is going to be something that is going to be very helpful for cross rollup interoperability. We think that it can mitigate things like operational costs and security issues and so forth that we've seen with those traditional bridges that none of us have loved. Um, and we think that, there's a lot of sort of synergies and overlaps in the way that we're thinking about the world and the future, and the way that, again, hopefully, having a shared sequencer set amongst various rollups can support the type of design that Catalyst is building. I'm curious since we're at Modular Summit, what components of the modular stack you are thinking about as being potentially key to be helpful.
yeah. That's a good question. I mean, I think transaction ordering or sequencing is super important. I do value, you know, I think you mentioned a lot of really good points of why a shared sequencer is important from a security perspective. For us, we agree with that, but we also see kind of the huge UX unlocks that kind of happen. Um, I think if you were to ask like any roll up as a service builder or just general roll up builder right now, their main gripe with interoperability is not the non-existence of it, but it's that it exists right now in a very painful format,
Yeah.
right? Latency, right, that span several minutes to sometimes even 20, 25 minutes to kind of perform actions between two different domains is a unacceptable kind of
Yeah.
user experience. And so having kind of a canonical sequencing layer or transaction ordering layer that you can kind of outsource if you're the world builders allows for a lot quicker kind of soft confirmations of those transactions, right? And
That's
for
definitely
us,
a core goal. Yeah.
yeah, definitely. And for us, because we are building at that application level, at the execution layer, we're kind of beholden to whatever kind of finality gadgets are in place for these modular blockchains. And so, again, outsourcing that to some sort of shared sequencer allows for a much tighter user experience for our users as well.
I love talking to application developers because you are actually thinking about the end users. And it's so easy as someone building infrastructure to just get lost in the architecture and sort of almost like the theoretical design requirements. But then to hear it directly from someone who's spending all day thinking about, like, no, our users need some kind of fast finality. It's suddenly like, oh, yeah, that's why we're designing things this way. Like, that's
Yeah.
why we've gone to all the trouble of developing hotshot consensus on our side, which is validating, but also, I mean, at other times can be like harsh reminders to those of us on the infrastructure side to make sure we're not getting lost in the weeds and make sure we're staying connected to yeah, you guys on the application developer side and the end users. One of the big memes I feel like of the last week at ECC has been, oh, everyone's building infrastructure, everyone's building all of this roll up infrastructure, yada yada. No one's actually building the killer applications. So I have to imagine, and as someone who's building infrastructure, I see those and I'm like, yeah, it's kind of right. But it must feel kind of validating to be one of the people who is building an application, and I think building an application in such a way that's actually taking advantage of like what the new infrastructure coming out is. Because again, all of this infrastructure is only worth anything if people are actually taking advantage of what it can offer.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I agree. I mean, like I love infra. Like, I will be the first person in my team to admit that, like, I'd probably nerd out way harder on infra
Watching
than
your
anything else.
presentation on Relays yesterday, I
Oh,
was like, "Oh, he's an infra guy at heart." Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's definitely like where my heart is. But yeah, I think, to your point, we recognize that, we do need to build applications to kind of onboard the next wave of users. And we kind of see ourselves in an interesting niche where we are an app, but it's kind of like a very simple app, right? It's like money. Like, that's like
Yeah. Yeah.
it. It's not like, lending, or it's not a game or anything. So we're trying
The
to
app
like,
that makes the world go around, though.
yeah, yeah. The very core like progenitor app of any blockchain, so to speak. And we do hope to go from there, but we're just trying to do the foundations
Yeah.
first. But we're a very infra aware app, right? And that's kind of where like my passion for infrastructure comes in, where like, I think it's one thing to be building like a DEX or some sort of like lending protocol, and you're like, yeah, like we're really, really good at doing that. But we don't really know, like the ground is literally shifting underneath our feet. Like we don't really know what's happening. Whereas with Catalyst, we're like, oh, we see the seismic shifts that's happening underneath, and we know how to like adapt and even build for those kind of fractures that are occurring.
I love that, an infra aware app.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that going forward. So I also wanted to just touch briefly upon something that I've started to hear about from you all, which is this notion of logic dependent swaps. Because I think that this is an example of being aware of those seismic shifts and aware of sort of what's coming and the possibilities, but I can't claim to fully understand it yet. So do you want to give us just a brief rundown? I won't ask you for a definition because those always get hairy. I feel like this
Yeah.
space loves semantic debates. But just of the background of where this idea behind logic dependent swaps has come from, sort of vaguely what the thinking is on what they'll mean for users.
Yeah, happy to. It's the name is still work in progress. I don't think end users are gonna say, "Hey, I really want to do a logic dependent swap today," right? I do think it plays pretty well into a narrative, or sorry, into the narrative of intents, where users or consumers rather are desire some sort of like end state, right? And they don't really care if it's the hops to get there, whether it's 1, 2, or n hops or what have you. And so it was kind of a happy occurrence from Catalyst, that allowed for the enablement of this feature. But basically, like there, as the name probably is, you can kind of,
Somewhat self-evident, I
yeah,
think.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's like you do things, you want something to occur, and there's certain things that happen before it, and they need to have these if conditions, and if they all kind of execute, then you can achieve it, right? And I think so the implication of it is obviously really large, because now you can kind of have this open design space of user expressivity, and all the kind of mechanics behind it get kind of abstracted, which of course just kind of plays intense. I think there's two things that are really special about logic dependent swaps that make it more interesting than just like a vanilla intent of like, oh, you can do another transaction after a transaction, right?
Yeah.
That's obviously cool, but there's more to it from our design.
And there's more that people want to do with it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So the first piece is that it's atomic, from the sense of, which again, definitions aside, like um, if if any part of the leg of a multi-hop kind of conditional fails, the whole thing reverts, right? And so I think when you look at like transaction bundling, that's not the case. Where
Yeah.
like, you're bridging or you're moving assets between 3 different chains, and then you want to vote on a governance proposal. And if any part of that fails, now you're stuck with some intermediary assets on some intermediary chain that you didn't even wasn't even aware that you were
Yeah.
interacting with,
Oh
right?
God.
So that doesn't occur for us, luckily. So there's atomicity from that regard, right? But it's asynchronous. I think where the synchrony comes in is where you add something like espresso, right? Where
Yeah.
now you
I
can
hope so. Yeah.
introduce, yeah, totally. This is what I'm super excited about. Like we were talking about this earlier, but you literally induce validity at the origin of the swap. And so I think there's a really big conversation around like, how do you have, I don't even know the right word for it, but it's like validity sequencing, right?
Yeah.
Transaction verifying and sequencing. And how that, you need kind of state in the sequencer, and that's really tough. And it's better if the sequencer just does pure transaction ordering.
Which is what our design does today. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think what's cool is when you add in the sequencing piece with logic-dependent swaps, you're like, oh, I know this swap will go through.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool, I think.
And is it builders facilitating the logic-dependent swaps, or sort of who are the entities involved here?
It's basically induced at the application layer.
Okay.
And it's Catalyst specific. And,
got it.
And like I said,
okay, cool.
Yeah, this was kind of more like a happy occurrence, like happy accident almost, from our design, because we don't have to get into the weeds, but the way that Catalyst. Okay, sure. Why not?
We can go for a second. Yeah.
So the way.
Pull you back out.
Yeah. No, I'll pull myself out because I know this is really deep in there, but Catalyst is built in a way in which like we have how do I say this? Like it's not a swap that's being done in one direction. It's actually bi-directional. And so wait, that probably doesn't mean anything, but so I think when you look at a lot of applications right now, a lot of cross-chain applications, they do kind of like, we call it a call and pray, where they're kind of just shooting things out.
Yeah.
And they're hoping that something happens on the destination.
Yeah.
And so when you have something like a transaction failure, right, if you want to have a multi-leg transaction, you can't have it shoot back to you.
Right. Yeah. You just get stuck.
Yeah. You get stuck in the middle. And if you look at any, cross-chain liquidity network, not to, name names, but usually when a transaction fails, you're usually stuck with like some asset on the destination chain that's not the asset you wanted.
Right.
And so like for us, because we have this kind of bilateral communication, that doesn't occur for us. And so we don't have a call and pray messaging mechanism.
No,
we have a round trip mechanism.
Yeah.
And so every message that we send into the void, into the destination chain, be carried by relayers from my talk, we know that it's going to come back, and we have information of what's returned. And so one of two things can return. One is still a message that said, congrats, it happened. And you're like, cool. Or it says something bad happened, and you're like, that's totally fine. I'm just going to give the original asset back to the user.
Yeah.
Right. So it's escrow.
Nothing's happened.
Yeah.
No one has been harmed.
Yeah, exactly.
The user hasn't ended up with some crap on some other chain that they don't actually know about or want, or now they have to go find out about. Super interesting. Well, this has been a very enlightening conversation for me. Thank you so much. Final question is just what from the last couple of days are you most excited about? Like, what's something you learned or heard that you're like, oh, that's going to be a game changer?
I'm going to give kind of like a fluffy answer.
Sure. It's a fluffy question, so that's totally fair.
Well, I have a few, but I think the one that I want to say the most is there's just such a grow the pie mentality that I've observed. I think I'm not sure if it's always been there and I just like wasn't seeing it, or if it's been unearthed in like the recent months. But I've been having dinners with, what I think people might call competitors at Catalyst. And we all agree that we're not going to fight over 3 marbles. We'd rather just bring more marbles to the game. And I've been seeing that with every kind of vertical.
Totally feel that.
Yeah.
I think it's partly a bear market thing too. It's like in a bear market, we're all just kind of like, we just need any of this to be a thing. And we all got to band together and make all of this be a thing. Where it's like we're fighting against the status quo, not each other. But I agree, that's been really, really a lovely part of this whole week.
Yeah, maybe it has been a bear market thing, because I feel like it hasn't always been the case in the past few years.
But we got to carry this energy into the bull market. because it's coming. I
Yeah.
believe it's coming.
Yeah, me too.
Well, this is a great way to wrap up my week. Thank you so much for your time, Jim. And
Yeah.
we'll leave it there.
Thanks for having me.